Welcome to Putschcast. Before I do anything else, I'm supposed to tell you to please subscribe. Yes, and you can watch us now in case you're listening to us for a while. We're now available as a video version. Just look Putschcast up on YouTube. On YouTube, you can simply hit subscribe and most importantly, tell all your friends and foes about it. As always, I'm not alone. I've got my co-host Christos in the studio. Hey, Christos. Good evening.
Good evening.
Christos, I'm proud to share that tonight I'm the person with the shortest surname. And the good reason for that is I've got two Greeks on the call. So, Christos, what is your full name and what brings you here today?
My name is Christos Papadopoulos. I was born in Greece, but as you can hear from my accent, I'm not raised in Greece. I grew up in Germany and now the last 20 years here in Australia.
So you've got three cultural connections, and I think that's really valuable for the podcast tonight. And that's what we always do on Putschcast. We try to have an expert on the call, but also someone who just knows about the culture and can tell us about a perspective that we may not be aware of as people living in the English-speaking world. Now, we're talking about Greece. I've already mentioned that, Christos. Greece is the topic today, and you might be thinking, oh, God, there's so much to talk about. We are narrowing it down. I don't think we will be, but the topic is very specific. Most people who think of Greece, ancient Greece, right? Troy, 300, all the stuff, you know, from Hollywood as well, that people are familiar with. And then most people think Greece, maybe the last 20, 30 years, they think, you know, financial crisis, riots, and a wonderful, beautiful holiday destination. That's probably the cliche, I'd say.
Yeah, but this is actually only small parts of it. I mean, the ancient Greek history is huge, which brought a lot of inventions, new ideas, medicine, mathematics, philosophy, and all these things. And then we make a big jump from the ancient Greek now the last, let's say, 20, 30 years, which is actually not the glory part of the Greek history. But in between, there is a lot happening all the years.
Yeah.
Apart from where it was a little bit dark under the 400 years Ottoman occupation. But this is a part now that we are most likely talk about.
Yeah, and we picked this date that most of you probably not familiar with, and it's a specific year. It's the year 1821, because it's seen by many as the starting point of the Greece that we know today. So the modern Greek state traces its roots back to specific events around that time. Broader context, obviously, Napoleon is just done. It's not the era of revolutions yet. So if you think about 48 was a big year for revolutions. In the 1830s, we had a big year for revolutions. But the year 1821 is not that well known, but it's crucial for Greek history. And again, we're lucky. We don't need to explain any of that, Christos, because we've got an expert on the call. Yeah. And I'm very, very excited to have him join now on Putschcast. His name is, and again, I'm trying my best with pronunciation, Dr. Michalis Sotiropoulos, and he's coming to us live from Athens, I believe. Hello.
Yes, that's true. Hello to you too, and many thanks for inviting me.
I'm excited to have you here, and I just, talked about Christos, and usually at the start of Putschcast, we always explain what our connection is to the topic. We've done previous episodes on Mexico. Never been there, unfortunately. We did one on Haiti, which is how this one came about, because Nikolai Vanegas is I think a friend of you or another academic you work with closely, and we talked about the Haitian revolution. But today, I have been to Greece. I've been to Greece 3 times. I out myself as a Grecophile. I love the country, love the history. Biggest issue with me is I don't know enough about it, so I'm very excited about the episode. Michalis, but before we talk about your biography in a minute, you don't usually live in Greece, though, do you?
No, I'm actually in between Scotland and Greece, because I work at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland the last 2 years. So now I'm getting used to this, going from Greece and from Scotland to Greece and from Greece to Scotland. But the funny part is that Edinburgh, the nickname of Edinburgh is the Athens of the North. It came from the Scottish themselves when they tried to replicate like ancient Greek buildings and use the neoclassical architectural style to rebuild Edinburgh in the late 18th century and the early 19th century. So, it's funny because I moved from Athens and went to the Athens of the North.
I believe it's not the only European city where that was attempted. I think Munich in Bavaria is very much like that. I think we'll talk about that in a minute. First of all, again, most people wouldn't have heard about 1821, connecting it to Greek history. Why should people know about it?
Well, because it was one of the revolutions that took place in a very peculiar and actually very interesting revolutionary wave. More or less the third revolutionary wave, if we take the French Revolution, the American Revolution as being the first revolutionary wave, then we go to the second, which is the 1810s and the Latin American revolutions, including, of course, the Haitian one. And then the third one is the wave that takes place in Southern Europe, roughly speaking, and includes the cases of Spain, Portugal, the Italian Peninsula, and the Balkan Peninsula. That means the Greek revolutions. It's part of a very wide moment in the history of the revolution. The second reason is more Greek, if you want, because it was the founding moment of the modern Greek state. So it's one of the rare moments that we have in European history at the time that there is a revolution, and out of this revolution came a new state. Some provinces seceded from the Ottoman Empire, and we had the foundation, the creation of a new state, which in itself, if you think about the times, was like a big moment, a watershed in European history, not least because it was the first time that the Ottoman Empire lost territory. And then you had like a new state being born, new European state being born at the far end of the European continent. So that in itself is, of course, important.
Speaking of the Ottoman Empire, so that was interesting to learn that this was the beginning of the end, really, because it just went downhill from there for the next 100 years for the Ottomans. And for everyone who wants to know more, please check out our episode on the fall, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. We just released that a few weeks ago with Professor Adrian Jones. He's an expert on the Ottoman Empire, the late period. However, 100 years earlier today. Christos, back to you. Now, as I said, if it wasn't for Putschcast, I probably wouldn't really have heard about the Greek Revolution of 1821. And yes, it went on for quite a few more years. And there's other names for it too. Some people call it the Greek, Independence War. And so it's the same historic event with different names. But in your upbringing, and being aware that you didn't grow up in Greece, but you grew up in the Greek community,
Absolutely.
You speak the language. In your childhood and today, how important is this event still in Greek culture?
It's very important. There are two significant dates in the Greek festive calendar. And one is the 28th of October, where Metaxas, back then the prime minister, said no to the ambassador from Italy when they wanted to come to Greece. Other one is the 25th of March, which is the beginning of the revolution, even though the date is not exact that, because it was not a start of a revolution exactly on the date, but it was later established by Otto, the German king that was established.
Yeah.
Back then it was determined that the 25th of March is the start of the revolution.
So confirming it's a public holiday in Greece?
Absolutely.
Okay.
It's a public holiday. It is celebrated with parades.
Yeah.
Military parades, school parades through all the country. Even every village has their own parade.
Yeah.
So, and as a kid, you grow up with that.
So, Michalis, can you confirm that? So you live in Athens a fair bit. So is that public holiday a big deal? And therefore, that's an excuse to talk about the topic and it's in living memory?
Good memories of your childhood are the days that you don't go to school or you don't have to go to school. And it's a moment when people discuss the event itself, reassess, revisit it, not always in the most productive way, if I can say that. We will talk about that more probably later, but it is a day of celebration. And exactly like Christos said, it's interesting that in Greece we celebrate the resistance days in both cases. It's the resistance against the Ottomans in the first case, against the Germans and Italians in the second. And I'm saying that because it's not always the case. In other countries, in many other countries, they celebrate actually the end of the war. In Greece, we celebrate the beginnings of the war, which is interesting. Some people have criticized that. To be honest, I think, celebrating resistance, it's not a bad idea.
And I think it's important for people, listeners in particular, to understand who grew up in countries that were never occupied, right? There's a few countries out there that just have never gone through this. But for countries who were living under oppression, under rule of a foreign nation, it's an important, and I think of the Polish people, for example, who similar to the Greeks were centuries, right? And it was such a big moment when the Polish nation first came together again. America is a bit different because it was a colony, but there's other countries that lived under occupation. So is freedom and national sovereignty more important to Greek people than people from other countries?
Well, yes, probably. Not least because we have to take into account, because you mentioned also the Polish case, that exactly as you said, that there were usually greater powers controlling or ruling over some of the territories that actually made the Greek state. But also that Greece, like also many other countries, not the Polish case, is a fairly small state. And all these fairly small states, and you can think of many, of course, in the European continent especially, but also in the Middle East and elsewhere, they always had to negotiate their existence with the great powers or with the powers that be each time. So for these states, for these countries which are small and which always had to deal with someone bigger than them, the issue of national sovereignty, the issue of nationalism, of national identity becomes much more important, and it makes sense. And as you said, I live in the UK. The UK was never conquered. There was a danger of being conquered, but it actually wasn't. So that in itself creates a very different mindset, both for the state, but also for the people who live in it, when the danger is not there. In the Greek case, but also many, think of the Balkans, Central Europe, that was not the case. And even today, we are facing wars in the Middle East, in the Black Sea, and in many cases you have states which have to fight against bigger powers. So this is the fate of all these small states.
Yeah, and you just mentioned small state a few times. So confirming for our listeners that Greece wasn't what we think of it today. So in the year 1820, the Ottoman Empire was vast. It was going all the way from what now is Bosnia-Herzegovina down to past Medina on the Arabian Peninsula, Northern Africa, and of course Turkey, Syria, and the whole, really what we now call the Middle East almost. That gives us the geography. The year's 1821. What happened that it all came together in that year? What was the context?
If someone wants to understand the context of the Greek Revolution, we have to go backwards in time. So to think of the geopolitical context, but also to take into account this wider Ottoman context. And I will come back to that. So the geopolitical context was defined by the coming of three empires in the region. And when I say the region, I mean the Eastern Mediterranean at large, not just the Greek peninsula. The first empire that came to the region and kind of changed the balance was the power that I usually call the omnipresent power in all things Mediterranean at the time, and that was the Russian Empire. This is part of Peter the Great's, mainly Catherine the Great's plan. And Catherine the Great's plan was actually for the Russian Empire to get a foothold in the Eastern Mediterranean. So Catherine did two things. One was actually to send a Russian fleet, to circumnavigate the European continent and enter the Mediterranean through Gibraltar. That kind of failed, even though some ships eventually landed to the Eastern Mediterranean. The other thing that Catherine did was to invite the Greeks. So for many Greeks, and I'm sure Christos can verify that, Odessa and Mariupol in Greek were considered kind of Greek cities.
And everyone knows Mariupol from the horrible battle that just happened there a few years ago with the Russians, right? Pol means city, right, in Greek. Yeah. So And
Exactly.
you're not familiar. Oh, wow! I never thought about it. Thank you. Yeah.
No, actually, it was a big blow also for the Greeks, the destruction of Mariupol, because the presence of Greeks there was very visible. Monuments. I mean, it was one of one of those cities in which Greeks migrated massively 2 centuries ago. So that was part of Catherine the Great's plan. So the effect of that was, the involvement of Russia and the Russian Empire into Greek affairs and Greek Ottoman affairs. Second, the coming of the French. And the crucial moment here is the fall of the Venetian Empire, the Venetian Republic, and the Venetian Republic and the Venetian territories were taken over by the French. Part of these territories were the Ionian Islands. Most people know them today as famous tourist destinations: Corfu, Kerkyra, Zante, Zakynthos, Kefalonia, Kefalonia, Ithaca, Ithaki, Ulysses. So these islands were part of Venice, but then they became part of the French state. Actually, they became a département, 1797.
Just before under Napoleon, really.
Exactly. The islands become part of the Greek state, so the French literally come. The third power that comes into the region, of course, is the British Empire. Napoleonic Wars, so there are many, many wars between the French, the Russians, and the British at the time. The Ionian Islands became a battleground between all these empires. Just to show you the complexity of the issue, the Ionian Islands, being French at the beginning, they turned out to become British eventually in 1815. They actually became a British protectorate for like 50 years until 1864, when they were offered by Britain to Greece. So now they're part of the Greek state because Britain decided to leave the islands to Greece. So as you can imagine, we have like a very weird and difficult situation, very complex situation on the ground, right at the time when the Greek Revolution actually erupts. Now, the fourth player in all this is, of course, the Ottoman Empire, which was in a kind of a crisis because of the coming of all these empires into the region, and also because of what that meant for the Greeks, was that many local magnates, and a famous one was Ali Pasha, household name for Greeks. Ali Pasha was had created a state within a state. And he was controlling a region that roughly corresponds to a big part of what is today the Greek state. So,
is that what we nowadays call a warlord? Was he basically a warlord running his own little on his own terrain?
Yeah.
So not a legitimate
exactly,
government or anything. He was just like a rebel leader, and he was successful enough to just carve out his own neck of the woods.
Exactly. So he was appointed by the Ottomans. He was an Ottoman subject. Actually, Ali Pasha was Albanian, but he was a Greek speaker. So he was appointed by the Ottomans, but then he started becoming too powerful. Not just Ali Pasha, many others around the Ottoman Empire in the same period. Mehmet Ali of Egypt, the founder of Egypt, was another one. So what the Ottoman state decides to do at some point is to go against all these local magnates, those warlords. And this is important for the Greeks because many Greek warlords who were later going to be very much involved in the Greek Revolution were actually collaborating with Ali Pasha. So, when the central state goes against Ali Pasha, these people are left without a job, if we can call it that, but also without a power base, without a sense of community that Ali Pasha had actually created, because he had created like a independent, kind of semi-independent territorial administrative unit. And also there is a danger of being massacred by the central state. So for them, it's a crucial decision of life or death. In 1821, the decision of people to actually do something which at the time was a crazy thing to do, going against the Ottoman Empire and having a revolution against the empire, was not the most reasonable decision that someone could take at the time, as you can imagine.
David versus Goliath, right? This gigantic empire, and a couple of
Exactly.
warlords who happened to speak Greek. It was interesting that you then said he wasn't even actually Greek; he was Albanian. Christos, you following or any new information so far?
No, I'm following. There are a few things that Michalis mentioned that are new to me. However, what is very interesting, what I realized is this revolution, it's not established state, is a lot of movement at that time. Michalis mentioned the English, the French, the Russians, Ottoman Empire, local warlords. So it's a lot of movement at that time.
Mm.
And then you have the little group or little Greeks, then they are stand up. And as far as I understand, and please correct me, Michalis, the revolution was not started only on one point.
Okay.
There were different points that they started. The revolution started from many areas.
Yeah, and that is, for me, that's news as well. I had no idea about the presence of the foreign powers at the time. Ottoman Empire was obvious because it was the reigning power and it was their territory at the time. Can I ask you why they were all there? So you said the Russians were interested. I get that because that's what Vladimir Putin was just trying to do in Syria very recently, to have a foothold, a base on the Mediterranean. If you control the Dardanelles, you control the Russian Navy, basically, in the Black Sea. But France and Britain, what was their interest? Did Greece have a booming economy, or what was the main interest there?
Definitely no. So Greece was not a booming economy. But what is crucial geopolitically in the area were always, and that is also the case today, were the trade routes. The Aegean and the Black Sea are very crucial for this trade. Later on in the 18th and 19th century, and even today, what was crucial was, of course, the grain that was coming from what is today Ukraine, the biggest grain producer in Europe. So that trade from the Black Sea was going through the Aegean. And the other factor which was important, that who was controlling this trade at the time? Actually the Greeks. So the Greek maritime fleet, especially in the late 18th and early 19th century, was very, very important. So the Greeks knew how to navigate the waters, they were controlling the trade, so that this part of the Mediterranean was very crucial for the European powers, exactly because of trade. This is the moment when the British land in Sicily. They take control of Sicily for like 15 years, I don't remember how many years exactly. They take control of Malta. They take control later on of Cyprus. They take control of the Ionian Islands. So this is the moment, the Mediterranean moment in the history of the British Empire. Mm-hmm. And the effect was great on the Greeks, of course.
And you mentioned that before, Christos. We're talking 400 years of occupation. Now, if I think of any other nations, any other people, there wouldn't be really much left of an ethnic, cultural identity after 400 years of occupation. Can you two please discuss how that happened?
I speak generally, and Michalis can then go more in the detail. I can speak a little bit about me, even on a short period of time.
Please.
I think part what you are, it's where you're coming from. I come from a family in northern Greece, where then lived in today Bulgaria. And then in 1922, when the borders were drawn, they moved into the Greek part. Back then in the Ottoman Empire, where even though they were Greek identity, they would identify them as a Greek. Yeah, they may speak another language, Slavic, Turkish, or whatever. But I think a very strong point was the faith, religion, which hold them all together. And my family then, because they were identifying themselves as the Greeks, they moved on because they didn't want to be in Bulgaria.
Mm.
Yeah, so, and I think this is how they survived over a generation. If we are calculating a generation about 30 years, yeah, it's about 13 generations around this number, yeah? And surviving 13 generations with the identity, you have to be very, very strong.
Yeah, Michalis, I'm thinking of the Egyptians, for example, right? An ancient people, much older than the Greeks, absolute distinct, unique culture, ahead of the game. But after centuries and centuries of Arabic occupation, so to speak, I know Egyptians get very offended if you call them Arabs, but there isn't that much left of the Egyptian culture that we know from antiquity. What is your view on that? How the Greeks made it through as a people through those centuries of occupation, and does it have to do with a fairly lenient, relaxed occupation policy by the Ottoman Empire?
Well, yes. First of all, I'm not sure whether I would call it lenient. The Ottoman Empire has a very, very interesting history in general because the governing techniques were changing. And this, is, of course, goes for all empires. And I will come back to that. But I think I have to agree with Christos. I think religion here plays a huge role, not least because it was one of the religions which were recognized and tolerated by the Ottomans, which is very crucial. And not only that, but gradually the Patriarchate in Constantinople or Istanbul, Turkish capital today, was recognized as the leader institution of the Greeks or the Greek Orthodox. And this is a very, a very contested term because by that the Ottomans meant the Christians of the empire, not necessarily the Greek-speaking Christians, because they could be Armenians, they could be, Georgians, Albanians, Egyptians.
Clarifying, only because you spoke Greek didn't mean you were Greek at the time.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. No,
I mean, if you were a Christian, you would belong to the so-called millet. This is the way in which the Ottoman Empire was actually dividing the population.
Yeah.
But gradually, in the 18th centuries especially, there was, we can call it that, a kind of nationalization of the denomination of the faith. So gradually many Greeks, many Orthodox people came to identify, especially the Greek-speaking Christians, with the Greek nation. Two things are important. One, faith, and the other is language. The Greek language, the register of the Greek language now, of course, is very different than the ancient Greek register or the medieval register, but still it's the same language. So that the language itself brings with it and within it a culture. And I think these are the two ways through which the Greeks kind of preserved a separate identity, or at least a sense of Greekness. It doesn't mean that they viewed themselves as part of the same nation necessarily and always. But at some point, and for many people at the time, they saw themselves as part of a wider community. From the 18th century onwards, that community started becoming, or at least having, a bigger sense of itself as a separate national community. To go back to something that Christos knows much better than me, even today, when Greeks go somewhere, they sometimes probably will define themselves by the local place where they come from, or where the family comes from. People from Tripoli or from Arcadia, people from the islands, from Andros, they would say, I'm from Andros, I'm from Crete, especially these strong local identities. That was even more pronounced back then. But it's still the case today. But at the same time, we will say, we're Greeks.
I can absolutely confirm what Michalis said. I live in the third biggest Greek city, actually the biggest outside Greece, in Melbourne.
Yeah.
We were fourth, fifth generation Greeks live there. And you see the people identify themselves as Greeks. And not only as Greeks, I'm Spartan. I'm from Kalamata. So it's very interesting. They were born here, grew up here. Their parents were born here.
Yeah.
Maybe grandfather came here or great-grandfather came here. And they still identify, I'm from Kalamata, or I'm from Pyrgos, or whatever they came from. So I think it's also how you identify yourself. Even though they are fully Aussies or Australians, but identification is still, I'm Greek and I'm coming from there.
I think my theory is that it has to do with those 400 years of occupation, that, and as we call it in German, there's a word called Lokalpatriotismus, local patriotism, which is literally down to the village, like I'm patriotic about my little community. And that probably has helped, because I want our listeners to understand again that Greece, at the time we're talking about, over 200 years ago, was not the Greece of today. There was Greeks living everywhere, right? Like you said, where we now think of Ukraine all the way down to Egypt, etc. Like it was still the remnants of Alexander the Great, almost, wasn't it? Like the way the population was spread, and there was many cities and towns in what is now Turkey as well. So it's not Greek or Greece as we understand it today. Now, Christos, before you put the theory out that there wasn't a single spark that caused this revolution, this uprising. Is that true, Michalis? And how did it actually happen? What happened in 1821 that violence erupted?
So the whole event actually started in what is today part of Moldova and Romania, kind of autonomous regions within the Ottoman Empire that were ruled by the Phanagiots, which was a Greek-speaking aristocratic elite, Christian elite. So these territories were, kind of strongholds of Greek-speaking Orthodox populations, just like further north in Odessa. The plan was designed by a secret society that was formed in Odessa in 1814, the so-called Friendly Society, Philikieteria.
There's a name. The Friendly Society got together.
Yeah.
The war.
Yeah, the Society of Friends. A very interesting society because, they had a code. It's in order to understand and to read the text from that society, you need to break the code. So, of course, now we know the code. It was a conspiracy. They tried to recruit people from all over the Balkans and southern Russia, and they were led by a Russian officer, Greek in Russian service, Alexandros Ypsilantis. So the plan was to start the revolution from the Danubian principalities and then actually go southwards towards the Balkan Peninsula because they had actually recruited many people there, and then they would turn to Constantinople. Now, the Danubian principalities revolt failed completely for reasons that we don't have to go through now because, it has to do with the local context. But then, in few days after, the revolution erupted in the Peloponnese. And that is the first crucial moment for the revolution. Why? Because it was a heavily Christian province. So it was kind of easy to get involved, to convince the population to get involved, to be involved in the revolution itself. So this is what started it. And the second crucial moment for me was the participation of the islands. So the islands, those naval islands that I mentioned before, they kind of, they were not very certain at the beginning, especially the local leaders and the elites of the islands. So they did not join immediately. But then there was a push from the populations, especially in Hydra, which was the strongest island. There was a push and from the population itself to actually participate in the revolution. So that kind of changed the initial fate of the revolution, if I can call it that, because immediately you had a naval power that could protect the Peloponnese and go against the Ottomans, because the Ottomans, the only way to send troops past was either by land or by the sea. And by the sea, they could not do it exactly because the sea was controlled by the Greeks. Third crucial moment is Christos will know the city. Maybe some of your listeners will not know the city, but it was Tripoli or Tripolitsa at the time, which is actually let's call it the capital of the Peloponnese. Many people from the Peloponnese, not from Tripoli, will hate me for saying that, but it was kind of the center of the Peloponnese at the time. Very crucial town because it was also where the Ottoman authorities resided. And there was a siege in the city, and it was taken over by the Greeks after a bitter and long fight, actually the massacre of the local Muslim population and the Jews by the Greeks. That is probably the first very dark moment, but that was a crucial moment because then, the revolution itself actually kind of established itself in the Peloponnese.
Yeah, so that was the fall of Tripolitsa, 1821 in September.
Yeah.
And blood on the flag of independence. I've got a quote from, I'm not sure if you know him, but William Sinclair, it's another historian apparently, who knows the topic quite well. And he said, the orgy of genocide exhausted itself in the Peloponnese only when there were no more Turks to kill.
Yeah.
So My enthusiasm for the Greek independence movement has shifted slightly. How did that happen? And it reminds me of the Bosnian or the Yugoslav war, where people lived side by side for generations. All of a sudden, they turn on each other and start butchering each other and killing each other just because one is Muslim and one is Christian. And again, I want to say this is a long time before any of or any atrocities like this happened in the rest of Europe, which obviously the late 19th century, 20th century is full of that violence based on sectarian lines. What was the reason for that? I mean, except for hatred. Do you know why was there so much brutality?
That was an event that shocked the Philhellenes, people like Thomas Gorton, who was in the region at the time, many other Philhellenes who were present, because usually they used to associate these feelings and these atrocities with Ottomans. Suddenly they saw the Greeks, the Christian, actually perpetrate these atrocities.
And in the eyes of the Europeans.
Yeah. Exactly, the good guys. I don't think if we don't get into the emotions of the simple people and also of the warlords who were there, there is this moment when, and that was very crucial for the massacre. So the warlords, or that is the leaders of the troops, and when we say troops, these were irregular troops. This is not an army. This is
militia that were probably ransacking and
exactly.
Yeah.
So the warlords were trying to control these troops, and at some point they lost them. They lost control of these troops. The troops believed that there was an agreement for some of the lords to take the loot for themselves. So there are some kind of misunderstanding. But the crucial thing is that what happened within the city was exactly. I mean, I wouldn't call it a genocide because that's this is a term that is anachronistic, probably to use for the time. But it was kind of ethnic cleansing. And of course, the Greeks then had to navigate through the consequences of that event, because it sent shockwaves to Europe. Again, I don't have an explanation. I think it's going to be very difficult to have an explanation of if we don't understand the feelings and the emotions of the people in the city at the time.
Because it wasn't just Muslims, right? Jews got caught up in this as well.
Jews, and of course.
Just as much. Christos, we talked about at the very start of the podcast how important this event is, and it's celebrated as national holiday. Does that dark side of it ever get discussed in Greek culture these days, or is it often forgotten?
No, you don't hear it, this dark side. But I would like to add something on it, not specific to Tripolitsa, but generally on the behavior of people, humankind. Normally, if you live in with different cultures in a small space, it is shown that there's always one superior culture, one is in the middle, and one is suppressed.
The bottom.
The bottom. And even though it seems that the Ottoman Empire was pretty liberal, how they dealt with other cultures, there were a lot of suppression. Yeah. And I think at some stage you can push people to a certain degree, and they build up this anger. And then when they see the opportunity, when someone starts, Filikieteria, Michalis mentioned, who propose a revolution or getting up against the suppressor, then all this anger that collected over the years, centuries, or whatever, they spill out. And we saw this in many revolutions that sent. And I assume something similar happened also in Tripolitsa.
I know. But there's always this moment where, there's one thing not liking your neighbor, there's a different story to kill your neighbor, over the family silver. But I think what Christos just mentioned, maybe for some people it was payback time over, decades, generations of oppression, and maybe second-class citizens. But also, as William Sinclair says, I like the word orgy, and that's just what happens in situations like this. It just becomes its own beast, right? So it's just 3 days of an orgy of violence. It turns into a massacre, and it wasn't the only one, I think. So let's quickly just talk about the foreign powers, because they were there at the start. They encouraged it, but you said that didn't do the Greeks any favor, that sort of event, because that got into the newspapers in all the major cities in Europe. So did the support for Greeks then wane, or how did they move on from that? Because obviously they relied on, I assume, funding and any sort of support from the English and the French in particular.
At the time, that was the way that they explained what happened in Tripoli and also in other places, was that theory of degeneration. So the theory behind it for many Western Europeans was that the Greeks, because they were under Ottoman rule for so many centuries, they had degenerated. They had lost, that essence that was coming from ancient Greeks. So that theory was saying that they degenerated because of the Ottomans, because of being under foreign and despotic rule, but now they have to be regenerated. So how were they going to be regenerated? By the help, with the help from the Europeans, the Western Europeans, because the Western Europeans at the time were actually saying that they were the ones who were carrying the torch of ancient Greeks, of classical civilization. Cradle of democracy was Greece, but now it had moved to Western Europe. I mentioned at the beginning the Endibras, the Athens of the North, but exactly as you said, there were many places in Western Europe at the time that were seeing themselves as the carriers of that classical civilization. New architectural buildings, neoclassical style, ways of dressing, reading, going back to the classics, and so on and so forth. So for them, the Greeks had generated, and they had to be helped also, and also to repay the debt that the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, had actually, to repay the debt of to the modern Greeks because of what the ancient Greeks had done for Western civilization. So what I'm saying is that they kind of gave an explanation, a theory behind it, behind these atrocities. And actually, you can see that also in many of the paintings. If someone sees Delacroix, for example, many of the figures of the Greeks kind of resemble the Ottomans, but they're not exactly like the Ottomans, like the Muslims, in terms of color, in terms of their physical characteristics. So the idea was that they would become like the Europeans because they were essentially Europeans, but they had degenerated, but they would have to come to be educated back to civilization. So the support in that way actually became even stronger in the years after, from 1822 onwards. The support came in 2 ways mainly, with volunteers who went actually to Greece to fight. Lord Byron is, of course, the most famous of all.
We know Lord Byron very well in Australia. He was the herald of the whole thing back in the UK, wasn't he? Like, he really helped to bolster the cause of the Greek independence movement.
Especially by dying. That's the tragedy.
Tell us more. What happened to Lord Byron?
I mean, first of all, Lord Byron, he was a big friend of this part of the world. He had visited the Ottoman Empire and the Greek, some of what became the Greek territories. When it came to the Greek Revolution, he was kind of reluctant to join it at the beginning. He kind of he was in Italy. He kind of thought of joining the Spanish insurrection, the Spanish Revolution. But his case was very important because he offered the revolution like a dimension that it didn't have before, because he was one of the celebrities of his time, right? So you have to think that Byron was very, very popular at the time, even before he came to Greece. Then he comes to Greece, he gets involved in the Greek revolutionary affairs. He also brings money with him, and then he dies. Sadly, he died of typhus, I think.
I thought he's going to die on the battlefield with a sword in his hands. He just died of a disease.
No. He never fought. He was the man. He was the man of the battle.
What sort of hero is he? Well, I guess with the...
Well, not all heroes have a sword or a gun.
Or a quill, in his case. Yeah. So, okay.
Yeah, exactly.
That's tragic, but before that, he really helped to get more support from the UK, for example.
Yeah, and also because he died and he died in Greece, he died for the Greek cause. That that offered again a visibility to the Greek cause that it did not have before.
Mm.
It's a it's the tragedy of like many revolutions, but the death of Lord Byron kind of made the revolution, the Greek Revolution, even a more European liberal affair than it was. And also the crucial moment, and Byron was involved, was the formation of the so-called London Greek Committee. That committee, which was made also of many important people, including Jeremy Bentham, liberal MPs, very important people also for the stock market and the sovereign market, the debt market. So they were the ones who actually managed to get a loan for the Greeks, for the Greek government. And that was a crucial moment in the history of the Greek Revolution because suddenly the support from European powers and European states took a new form. So because it was a moment when governments also were involved in thinking about an independent Greek state, or at least some kind of autonomy, maybe within the Ottoman Empire, maybe without, but at least the debate, the discussions opened up for them.
I agree with Michalis. I think you can't start a revolution without support, and especially of the powers of at that time.
Yeah.
We had lobbyists to support Lord Byron.
Yeah, perfect example.
Capodistrias, Ypsilantis were actually in the European, back then European diplomacy had a saying. And had a saying in Moscow or London or Paris. So, and they were lobbying for this as well. Of course, the big powers had their own interest as well. Yeah, without a doubt. They don't do it just because they love the Greeks. They see the advantages for them.
Yeah.
But also you need to have people who driving this thing in the background.
I really like, and I've never thought of the parallels to the American War of Independence. So, first of all, there's a motivation on economic side. So you mentioned trade routes before and shipping routes. In America, we had the Boston Tea Party. Then there's an actual moment of a declaration of independence, which happened in I think January 22, something like this. So just a few months in. And then there was a first parliament as well, right? So they went straight onto out of the caves, basically. This is an extreme, but straight back to the origin where this all came from, because the first proper parliament was in Athens initially. And this is again how probably the Europeans were supporting. It's like back to the values of the antiquity, right? But then there was a period, and you just mentioned it as well, for a few years, again, similar to America, which is called, like it's a war within the war. It's called the Greek Civil War. The whole period that we're talking about today takes 8-9 years roughly. So just the term civil war, does that tell me that all the Greeks weren't really united, that there was infighting as well, Michalis?
Well, yes, exactly as you said. So to start from the beginning, so there is a Declaration of Independence in 22. This follows the convocation of the first National Assembly, which also publishes the first constitution, the first revolutionary constitution, so that establishes a government, an army, and so on and so forth. This is an extremely important moment because that was both the declaration but also the National Assembly, because that was the way in which the Greek Revolution presented itself to the world. Right? Because you say that now we have an established territory, we have an established government, so we're going independent. So it's very important not just to declare that, but also to do it. And the crucial thing here is that the Greeks knew that. There were many Greeks around the Greek Revolution, not exactly participating in the Greek Revolution, who were pushing the Greeks on the ground to actually do a constitutional assembly and declare the independence. And the name of Ioannis Kapodistrias is very important here. Kapodistrias was actually working for the Russians. He was in the Russian diplomatic service. He was one of the two, at some point, foreign ministers of Russia. So Kapodistrias, he was very much advising the Greeks on the ground. and Capodistris, and I say that because, again, the Russian factor is very important. So Capodistris had an idea of what a revolution should do in order to be successful. And for Capodistris, the revolution, in order to be successful, would have to satisfy some criteria of statehood. And that was, to have a stable government, even if it was representative, and democratic, it didn't matter. To have a nation, so the language of nationalism was very crucial for Capodistris and for the Russians, to have a declaration of independence, to have a constitution, and to set up a government, but also to organize and set up a proper army.
The Russians had none of that. The Russians didn't have a constitution. They didn't have a parliament.
Yeah.
It was
Yes, but
at its best in Russia at the time still. So that's funny.
Yes, but at the time, especially after the Congress of Vienna, in Europe, Russia was seen as the liberal power. It had actually gave a constitution, of course, controlled by the Russians in Poland before. But at least for many people, the Russians were helping, or at least they could provide the advice, if you wish, and that was what Capodistris was doing. Now this happens in 1822, and that goes back to your argument about, whether there was a united front. At the same time, that constitution actually recognized something that had taken place in the first year of the revolution, 1821, which was the setting up of different local organizations. So you had actually 3 regional organizations in Western Mainland Greece and 1 in the Peloponnese. And then in the constitution itself, these were recognized as local governments, a kind of federal union. In the process, that made the actual running of affairs very, very difficult because, that was a new state, at least that was a revolutionary new state in the making, and then you have a central state that has to negotiate with this local organization. So there is a big discussion during the first years of the revolution what to do about these local organizations. The Second National Assembly decides to do away with them. And then immediately after, in 1824 and 25, we have 2 consecutive civil wars. And these civil wars, to me, and this is a very cynical argument, are the wars that made the revolution national and in some sense successful. Because you had all these local divisions, and revolutions are usually messy affairs. So you had many who wanted to go by themselves, or at least the Peloponnesians, for example, wanted to have like a sort of autonomous status within that new state. But for many, especially for many at the time participants of the Greek government, they wanted to nationalize the government. So they wanted to nationalize also the space. And this is what happened with the 2 civil wars. And I think a crucial moment for me is during the Second Civil War, the troops from what is today mainland Greece, that is above in the north of the Peloponnese, some of the best troops in the Balkan Peninsula at the time, irregular troops, very experienced, they decided to invade the Peloponnese. And that was a crucial moment because it kind of, and ironically and cynically, it nationalized space. The moment when someone with a very strong local identity coming from mainland Greece decides to invade the Peloponnese in order to crush the local lords of the Peloponnese is the moment when, for them, they think in national terms and they act on national terms.
Those mountaineers from the north marched in and the people on Peloponnese were sort of welcoming them.
Exactly. And also they massacred a lot of them.
Of course.
Like many in the Peloponnese, like local landlords.
Yeah.
And then that was, the moment when the revolution becomes national. But then the Ottoman Empire strikes a deal with the Egyptians, with Mehmet Ali of Egypt. And Mehmet Ali sends his troops with his son, Ibrahim, in the Peloponnese. They land on the Peloponnese and they crush the rebellion, they crush the revolution. So what happens was actually the revolution was going to be lost. But in 1827, in the so-called Navarino naval battle in Navarino Bay, which is in the south of the Peloponnese, the Allied fleet of the European powers destroyed completely the Ottoman Egyptian fleet. You had a de facto Greek state.
Just summarizing the last 8 or 9 years or so. So 1821, the uprising, it starts in various areas. Initially, somewhere what we now call Romania. There was an actual declaration of independence, which is crucial. There's a parliament. And then there was an actual civil war inside of Greece as part of that. And then the Egyptians got on board, which I think were part of the Ottoman Empire anyway, right? It was sort of like
of course.
semi-autonomous region. And so Ibrahim came over with his fleet, was very successful, almost crushed the whole thing. But then thanks to Lord Byron and all his lobbyism and his friends, the Europeans got involved, but quite a bit later, including the Russians. And that then, in the end, because we can't go through battle by battle, led to the Treaty of Adrianople. Is that the right pronunciation, or is that too Italian? The Treaty of...
No, it's Adrianople for us, but it's fine.
Cool. I'll take that one.
You need to learn Greek.
I am. I know. That's a different podcast, though. Me learning Greek, they'll get a lot more clicks because people have a laugh.
Many podcasts.
So that was then in 1829. And again, if people do want to know the details, you'll have to look it up, unfortunately, yourself. There's too much to talk about. Do Greeks get offended if I say the Europeans won your battle of independence for you?
Absolutely.
Okay. I better not say that at the local Greek club.
The Greeks fight it. Of course, as I said before, you need the approval from the big power. However, the actual fight was the Greeks and the willingness behind it.
Yeah. Is there, in this day and age, because you both mentioned a fair few names throughout this podcast, and I don't remember all of them, is there one iconic figure? Is there a Che Guevara of the Greek Revolution? Is there one particular freedom fighter, partisan that is celebrated today, or is there too many of them to name one?
Sometimes people pick the one who is from their own region. Of course, for me, to be honest, because I have studied the period, for me, my favorite is Georgios Karaiskakis, another household name. And the reason is that we have many letters written by him, or at least his secretary. He was swearing, cursing all the time. He couldn't actually make a sentence without actually swearing and cursing. Cursing can be very, very political, can be also very sharp. And that's why I liked him, because also he was one of those who shifted his allegiances during the revolution.
Yeah.
He was accused of treason. He was actually tried. The first one who was tried.
By his own people or by the Ottomans?
Yeah, by the Greeks.
The Greeks put their own field fighter on trial. That's another.
Yeah, because they accused him of actually speaking with the Ottomans and making a pact with the Ottomans, which was probably true. But the crucial thing is that the government at the time took the decision to put on a kind of show trial. So to make a case out of Karaiskakis, right? Again, you have to show that you have the power to do that as a national government. So they did, but of course they didn't have the power to do something with Karaiskakis, so they didn't have the power to actually put him in jail. And he actually dies a very heroic death in a battle. And of course, for me, it's Karaiskakis and then Kolokotronis, another one, household name. You can see many statues of these people if you come to Greece, they're everywhere.
And then as of 1830, we have the first modern Greek state. And the reason why I've got Christos here today is to talk about that, because there's so many links to Germany. It's so interesting. But I think we're really running out of time here, because this podcast is getting a little bit too long for our listeners, and I think we have to catch up again. But can I also ask you, in hindsight, it's always, the Greeks rose up and they fought really hard and the bad Ottomans, and then they finally gained their independence. And as you said, in Greece, there's no mentioning of foreigners. The Greeks did it all themselves. But was there any Greeks at the time that regretted that and didn't sign up for the Greek cause and actually sided with the Ottomans? Because, there's always winners and losers. Were there people, because I know Greeks were in Ottoman government as well. So, or was there obviously a lot of Greeks remaining in what was the Ottoman Empire? It's not that all Greeks now live in an independent Greece from 1830, right? So how did their life progress? Did the Ottomans keep an eye on them after the Greek Revolution and treated them any differently? Or what was their life like afterwards?
Well, of course, I mean, as you can imagine, many many people, many Greeks sided with the Ottomans, or at least did not wish to side with the Greeks because it was a very dangerous affair. In fact, the most notorious warlord of mainland Greece, Yorgos Varnakiotis, sided with the Ottomans. Now, of course, the Ottomans, there was a huge backlash in the Ottoman Empire against the Christians in general, and especially against the Greeks during the first years of the revolution. But at the same time, the Ottoman Empire was always very ready to negotiate and to rethink its affairs with its population. So many Greeks, especially those who actually lived in Ottoman territories after the event, and probably there were many more than those who actually lived in the Greek state, in the lands that became the Greek state. So they had to negotiate themselves, they had to negotiate with the Ottoman Empire again. And the Ottoman Empire in the process actually went into a series of reforms, one of which was to recognize the participation of local, of Christians or non-Muslims in the local councils. So that was an opening of the empire, partly produced and caused by the Greek Revolution and many other revolts that were taking place in the Ottoman Empire at the time. So they kind of opened up the gates for more political participation of this non-Muslim population. But this opened the door, of course, to nationalism. And that was, in some ways, the beginning of the end of the empire, because it was not an empire that was organized in national terms. It was an empire organized in religious terms.
It backfired on them. It didn't really work.
Yeah.
We won't have enough time, but we'll just talk another few minutes, Christos, because I think our listeners will find it, and viewers, again, reminding everyone out there that we're now on YouTube as well. You can watch us if you want to see three handsome men talk about the Greek history, especially between 1821 and 1829. Everyone else now would think, okay, 1830, independence, all the Greeks shake hands, happy, got their own government and democracy, because that was the whole idea, wasn't it? But what happened was something very different. It actually ended up being a kingdom. And the king of Greece after 1830 was everything but Greek, Christos.
No, it was Bavarian.
Which is a state in Germany.
Yes, it's a state in Germany, and back then, it was pretty independent. Bavaria, they've got their own king. I know that he was set up by the big powers to bring a little bit of certainty in.
Yeah.
And also to
join the European family.
Yeah, kind of, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that was Otto the First of Greece, right? I mean, you couldn't have a more German name than Otto. And his father, Ludwig, not the one with the fairy tale castles, that was the next one. But so his father, he changed the spelling of his own country. So Bavaria is Bayern in German.
Yeah.
And it used to be spelled with an B-A-I. And during the Greek Civil War, because he was so obsessed with Greece, he changed the I to a Y, epsilon, to make it look more Greek. And Bavaria is still spelled like this today, right? So if you look at Bayern Munich, that's why the football club is spelled like that.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and also then there is, there's various, again, we spoke about architecture, and there's many monuments and buildings in Bavaria that look like ancient Greece. And these are the Philhellenes, yeah? You said before. Foreigners loving Greece more than anything.
Yeah, exactly. And in this case, in the Bavarian case, you have kind of an institutional Philhellenes, because it's like a whole state and a whole royal family that is very Philhellenic. So yeah, I mean, to go back to, why Bavaria, why Ludwig, why King Otto, also it was a wish of the European powers. Let's not forget, this is Europe. Europe at the time was still a Europe of monarchy. In order for a state, especially a new state, to gain legitimacy, having even a foreign monarch was the way to do it. Now, for the Greeks, it wasn't a problem, because one of the problems that the Greeks had was this local division. So exactly because you needed a kind of unifying power, like a king that would be, of course, appointed by someone else, and a king who was not from Greece, because there were many enmities and divisions within Greece itself. Okay. So it was kind of, a way out. The problem was that it wasn't so much that he was a foreigner, but that he was a Catholic. That became a problem in the 1850s, because for the Greeks, they were saying that the next one, the higher, would have to be Orthodox. And that was the agreement. The problem was that Otto was childless. So that became a big issue in the 1850s, and then Otto was ousted, was dethroned in 1862 with another revolution.
Yeah.
And then the next king...
Coming up as a podcast here, I'm making that pledge now. Michalis, hopefully you join us for that one. So what was it, 1862, the coup against Otto? That's a great topic. I can't wait for that.
Yeah. I mean, it's a coup against Otto. He's dethroned. But this is not a coup against the monarchy as such, because actually the Revolutionary Assembly asks and votes for a new king.
Yeah.
And so that would be the new King George of the Greeks, of Denmark. So it's not, it has a lot to do with the loss of legitimacy from the Otto's, what people at the time used to call Otto's system. Some legacies in Greece itself, and you can see it in the building. Some of the buildings that someone can see even today in Athens were made and commissioned by Otto, and they follow this neoclassical style, and you can see it. I mean, whoever has ever visited Athens, these buildings are there, and you can see this influence from these neoclassical Bavarian architects.
A part of that, the Otto left something else behind in Greece. And is the German purity law for beer, where only 4 ingredients is allowed, except of Germany. The Greeks, Greece is the only country who brews beer after the German purity law.
There is a topic I'm very interested in, and again another idea for a podcast. Now here's another urban myth. First of all, apparently Otto spoke Greek very well because they were obsessed with it, but they came down there speaking ancient Greek, and they were so disappointed when they met the actual Greek population to say, hang on, that's not what we thought. We all thought they're like half-naked goddesses, speaking this ancient language. And then a lot of them were peasants with ancient rifles and spears, fighting the Ottomans. An urban myth I've ever heard, because the Greek flag is so iconic. And there's a reason why the Greek flag is blue and white. When you look at the Bavarian flag, that also happens to be blue and white. Does that go back to Otto and the Bavarians as well? Do you know where the colors and the layout of the Greek flag comes from?
I had not thought that it would go back to the Bavarians, because also these were colors that were used. During the revolution, you have 2 different flags being created.
Okay.
And the blue and white was being used, but not in the way that it was used later on in the Greek flag as we know it today. It was usually like, a cross, either blue or white, stuff like that. So, but I actually don't know.
Oh my God, I love leaving questions.
You caught me on that.
Oh, happy, and I'm so glad you admitted you don't make up stuff, because our listeners, they're going to point it out. If you know what the answer is, please leave it in the comments. Is the Greek flag that we know today related to the Bavarian flag, or is it coincidence? And also send us an email, putschcast@gmail.com. Christos, what's your final verdict on today's episode? Have you learned something?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Michalis, for all the details that you provided. As a Greek, and I went to a Greek school in Germany, so we learned these things, but not that much in detail. And also for the preparation for this podcast, I did some research. Plus Michalis' details, I learned quite a lot, and I understand now how things become together. So yes, I learned a lot.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, Christos, and I hope to see and hear you again on the podcast. You just gave us a brilliant topic there. I want to find out exactly how Otto lost his job. Michalis, can I ask you, we started this podcast talking about, 2,500 years of Greek history, and there's so much to learn and focus on. Why did you, for a career, pick this period of Greek history? What fascinates you about this?
Well, that's a very good question. Because it's very understudied. Usually people study the 20th century or ancient Greek history, or some people Byzantium, but the 18th and 19th centuries are very understudied, and I think because as in many other places, it was the moment when many things started, when many things that we are familiar with today actually started. And I wanted to understand the origins of it, these moments that were crucial for the making of the Greek state, for the making of Europe, because the Greek state is part of Europe, but for the making of the Middle East, for the decline of the Ottoman Empire, like these big moments that defined the region, that defined us as Greeks, but also the region. And I want to go back into the origin and study the origin, and also to get familiar with texts and languages and people that we're not very familiar with, even though we celebrate them, but we actually don't know them. And it's nice to find and to see these life stories, very interesting life stories of many protagonists, but also non-protagonists of the revolution itself. How they grew up, what they did, what they said, and this is a very different world than the ones that we thought it was when we learn about these things at school or even at the university. So that was the reason.
Yeah, and I did research, and there are not that many experts like you, so I'm very, very fortunate to have had you on Putschcast. And again, I'll contact you again. Everyone else out there, please give us a like, share, subscribe. We need this to get more experts on this podcast and to uncover more hidden parts of European and world history, because someone will be toppled next and we need to cover it and talk about it. So look us up, putschcast.com, or on all your favorite social media platforms. My name is Oliver Holte, your host, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.